This is part 2 of painting the Ninja Turtles from Zez. My name is your dad, and in the first video of my series of painting the Ninja Turtles, I have painted the bases for Leonardo and Raphael. Now, it is time for me to paint the frogs themselves. Also, in the last video, I had mentioned that I'm giving away uniformation gktwo. That is still ongoing, but this video, I'm giving away something else, and that is going to be one of the files of these Ninja Turtles. In fact, I'm giving away two of them, Raphael and Leonardo. So again, I'm just going to randomly pick a commenter. If you want one of these files, then you want to comment on this video and share it with your gran, because if your gran doesn't get to see it, she'll probably be sad. By the way, in one of the previous videos, I had mentioned that I use these trays, and this is pretty much how I use them to be able to transport my paints around, as well as in my Patreon, I give the full palette for what I've painted that week as a photo form on these trays. So if you're interested in getting the palettes for the colors that I used in the video, then the Patreon is a place for you to be. I need to empty this tray so that I can get started on the turtles. I also need to figure out what the friggin' hell color I'm gonna do to paint their skins, even if I'm personally worried a little bit myself. But before all of that, I just want to take a brief moment to quickly thank Uniformation for allowing us to be able to host a giveaway over on this channel. If you haven't already seen the previous video where I painted the bases for the turtles, I have been given a giveaway of a Uniformation GK2. And as we all already know, this is a fantastic printer that is available upon the market currently right now. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about this machine a little bit later on, but for now, let's get back to the video at hand. The most important thing for me is getting every single model part onto a stick of some kind. I use alligator clips on these little stick things, which helps sometimes grab them, sometimes I can stick that in a hole, but one of my most important things that I use for holding model pieces is old paintbrushes. Genuinely, if you make sure that your drain holes are 2 to 3 mils and bigger, then these will fit in, and as you can tell, I have a load of them. These are going to be the easiest things to hold my models with. When I'm painting a model, I usually like to start out with the thing that I feel like is going to be the most simplest, or at least the easiest thing to do. And in my case, that was the pants of this Ninja Turtle frog. And that started out by just painting them with a dark brown, giving them a shade over the top with a lighter brown, and a little bit of a dry brush to bring out some of the textures. However, I was not happy with the actual tone of the brown, and so I tinted it using Griff Charger Grey, whatever that color is, which is a contrast paint, and it is slightly transparent, meaning I can use it to tint with. And now obviously I have put a zenithal highlight in the previous video on these models. This means it's easy for me to use other contrast paints to paint over the top of this, giving me a roadmap to my highlights and shadows without even having to try. You may have noticed that I used two different colors to mix to make the green that I'm painting. That is the correct term for spraying paint out of your airbrush. And basically, the reason I did this is because I wanted to make it even harder for me to replicate this color, because as I had said in the beginning of the video, I didn't want these turtles to look exactly the same green. I'm gonna take some blue and use that to put shadows onto my green. This is a good time to bring out some definition on all of the muscles and all the dark areas and places that I want to be in shadow. Using green base, which is a lighter green, and this is from Ammo by Mig, I'm going to spray this through my airbrush very carefully into the high spots of all the highlighted areas that I want to be highlighted with the lighter green, using that zenithal highlight that I had laid down before as a roadmap to the light source. And while I left this to dry, I took some skeleton horde and I sprayed that over the front and back end of this turtle shell. And the reason for using the contrast paint, again, is because of its transparency. It shows through that zenithal that I had laid down previously. So I have managed to get what I think is an acceptable skin tone for this a turtle of destiny. And now what I need to do is start planning out the rest of the stuff. I actually really need to work on his shell. I gave it a little base coat, but I don't really accept what has happened there. So I need to paint some of the edges first, and then give it another base coat, and then I shall be happy. But the next step for me is going to be painting white on everything that needs to go red, and painting brown on everything that needs to go, well, brown. Now, a big part of my own personal painting style is to use the airbrush to create some shades and shadows that are otherwise a little bit more difficult with the brush on its own. But once I'm done that, I come back and I paint all the other parts using a brush mostly to get the details that I want. But before we get onto those little details, I'm going to quickly talk about the shell. Obviously, the green had messed up the edges of the shell, and so I needed to come back in and change that to a color that would take the browns over the top without looking murky. And so I used grey as the base tones for that. I very carefully airbrushed that in and definitely got overspray all over the place, but I don't care about the overspray, and I carried on working through building up volumes on top of the shell. A lot of the time what I'm trying to do is just layer layers over the top of each other, which is going to create a load of different colors on top of each other, making it look a lot more interesting. And now to paint this dude's lovely red that he has on the top of his head, I'm not going to fall for the same problem that I had before, and I'm going to paint grey first, and I'm also going to paint a little bit of white into the top parts where the highlights are, which you don't really see much in the footage. Going back to the knee pads, which I had base coated earlier, I'm going to take red leather very thin down in my airbrush and carefully spray that to create some nice highlights on the knee pads. Now you can see how easy that contrast red goes over the grey. It's a new day, and I need to carry on working on this project, but the problem that I have is that yesterday, in order to take some behind the scenes photos, I put the model together. And that means that I need to now take him apart. But don't forget, I still have to paint Leo as well. He is looking alright, although I have decided I feel like his shell's a little bit too light, and this means I'm going to need to darken it a little bit. So my goal for today is to get down every single last bit of base coating on, maybe a little bit of highlighting with the dry brush and stuff, and then tie that all together with the airbrush, and then get Raph done. Raph needs to be done today because Leo needs to be started tomorrow and done by tomorrow, otherwise there is no video. So let me stop faffing and get to work! I really want to make a super special shout out to the sponsor of this video, Zez Studios, who made and sculpted these models over on their Patreon. If you are interested in 3D printing models just like these, then you should definitely check out their Patreon. They are the ones who are bringing you quality over the quantity, and I'm going to leave a link for them in the description. Absolutely check them out. Their work is top notch, and let them know that I sent you when you get there. Now that I think I'm vaguely happy with how this body and shell looks on this dude, I'm going to go back in with Cygor Brown and paint all of the straps that adorn his lovely shell. I'm also going to take some grey and paint all the bandages that are across their legs and arms. I'm not quite sure why they're bandaged, but they look cool. And the reason that I'm painting them grey is because I'm going to come back and dry brush them with white a little bit later on, and this is going to make sure that the shadows are not pitch black or possibly green. Again, you can see I've used deck tan to paint before I've painted the red on top of the hand, and by saying again, what I mean is previously when I mentioned white, I probably meant deck tan. Don't worry about it. I'm currently using deck tan, however, to dry brush those bandages. Then I'm going to paint some of that red, a lovely contrast paint over the top of the red parts that need to be red. Also, what I want you to take note of is that what I'm doing with the dry brush here is I'm building up in layers, and when I'm done with that, I'm going to come back with a little bit of skeleton horde and spray that in just little patches to make the bandages look a little bit dirty, because if they're too clean, it's not going to look right. I'm now going to take some black and paint that over the weapon on his hand. Also, speaking of dry brushing, I'm also going to dry brush some of that red leather to just reinforce some of that painting that I had sprayed a little bit earlier on the knee pads, but at the same time I'm going to use it to bring some of the details out on the straps across his body. Once a part is painted, using a wash is a really good way of blending things together, but I really disagree with painting it on with a brush, and I would prefer to airbrush this over, even if there is a bit of overspray. But choosing your wash wisely would mean that the overspray would be super unnoticeable, and it definitely help to sell the effect of the shadows and the highlights. I took what appears to be not such a silver, and I painted that over the weapons and also the little studs on every single little knee pad and elbow pad upon this model. Also, on the grip of the weapon, I don't even know what these things are called, his friggin' fork, basically it needed to have a red wrapping around it, and obviously I needed to paint that first with deck tan before I painted the red on it. I then glued a lot of the parts together for this model because I feel like using magnets at this point is just so much extra effort, and I genuinely can't be bothered because I have 2 models to do just this week alone, and my stress levels are a little bit high. A quick thing to note about my completely ADHD filming that I have done is that I do tend to go back on things. Sometimes I'll notice something that I feel like could be just taken a little bit further. Genuinely though, when I'm painting models for my channel, specifically on a weekly basis, and there's this much work to do, I don't take this to the absolute level. This is what I would consider a tabletop version of painting a model. So if you wanted to follow along with this, technically I would say these are simpler techniques that make it easy to produce a model that looks pretty good but doesn't require way too much work to get done. Kind of like turning the airbrush down and using that to spray some speckles of texture on the model. So I have now got Raphael to a point that there's a couple of small things to do and he'll be done. Mostly his mouth and eyes. That's pretty much it. It's time for me to start working on a Leonardo and oh yes, what I was gonna say is I need to take him apart and put him on some sticks so that it's easier for me to paint. As we start the second set of skin for the second turtle, I'm going to approach this in a totally different way. This time I'm going to use a wash and the orc flesh, which is Drakenhof Nightshade and orc flesh mixed together in my airbrush to create my base tones of the green. And as you can tell already, this is looking a little bit brighter than what Raphael's was. And now my thought patterns for this really was the fact that Leonardo is the leader and more brighter, as well as he would be in the front of the entire diorama, so he should be brighter than what Raph is. Raph is also a dingier, darker character, so his entire skin tone being darker helps to sell that. Everything else you see in the background is pretty simple really. I did most of this on the other model. It's all base coats and I mostly just use whatever paint is available to me and is easiest to get to. What I do tend to do though is use contrast paints to create vibrant colors over whites and grays, as opposed to using Vallejo for example, which is a solid paint that I feel like I would paint a solid color with at the end of the day. As for the shadows on this particular skin tone, I wanted it to be just a bit different from the other one's shadows, and so I mixed again some colors to create a slightly different tone. Let me just show you what I walked into this morning, and that is basically a whole load of parts precariously hanging in places all across the equipment that I have in my studio. But this is honestly been the safest way I've actually had in drying parts. Yesterday what I managed to do was get a main color and a shadow color onto the model, but now what I need to dropping a freshly painted model can be disappointing, but what is not disappointing however is the uniformation gktwo, and I really need to take a few moments to just talk about this machine. Mainly because sponsors, you know, that's how these things work. This machine, by the way, is genuinely, honestly, one of my favorite machines. I would not even be coming close to advertising this machine nearly as much as I do if I didn't honestly believe in the machine itself. I've had my machine for over a year now. In fact, I've had 2 of these machines, one of them for a little bit longer than the other, but Genuinely, I haven't had any issues with this machine so far. My screen has lasted all this time so long. Honestly though, if I did have any problems, the communication that I have with Uniformation is really great. I can't speak for everybody, however, but personally, the way that they treat me as a customer, or at least as a sponsor, is honestly extremely great. Very important features about this machine that I specifically like is the fact that the vat can just come out without any screws. Also, the build plate goes on with a little clip. It's one quick clip and it's done. Another thing that really is great about this machine is the fact that I can put it on my shelf really close to each other and the lid just lifts up. I don't need to have to lift off a lid and find somewhere to place it at the end of the print. Now, anyone who has followed me or seen any of my videos would know that I'm a very practical kind of person. I don't really take in too much of the numbers and the fancy words and all the cool things that go along with learning a new hobby. What I do, however, know is high quality, and what I like to produce is high quality, and this machine really helps me to do that. I'm able to print down to 29.6 microns, which for everything that I do pretty much is super great. The build volume size on this machine is 5.04 inches by 8.97 inches by 9.6 inches on the height. It's huge. It's big enough to do 99% of the models that I make. In fact, this has printed almost all the models you've watched in almost all the videos over the last year. This Uniformation GK2 is a machine you should look at, and I urge you to check in the description for more information about it right now. Now, you may have noticed something in one of the last few videos, and that might have been a song that I had used. That was completely AI generated. There is no link to this song. I'm going to do my best to make some form of a music video or something so that I can upload that on its own, but for now, you can just listen to it while I prepare for my morning worth of work.
3D printer goes a new model is printing, now it's time to prep it. Sand it smooth and fill all the gaps. Nothing loose like your mother's flaps. 3D printer goes brr. Pour in the resin, load up the slice. My name's your dad, I bet your mom would think that's nice. Time to produce some plastic, more models to paint, more shelf space to take up. And if one falls off in place, it won't matter, because I can just print another. 3D printer goes brr. Pour in the resin, load up the slice. My name's your dad, I bet your mom would think that's nice. Take out my web palette and drop some water. I don't use no filters. Put out my paints and pick the right colors, cause I'ma make a sick video, and then everyone will think I'm super cool. 3D printer goes brr. Pour in the resin, load up the slice. My name's your dad, I bet your mom would think that's nice. Magnets or glue, it doesn't matter how you put it together, as long as it's dope, you know it'll fit nice on the shelf.
Hopefully you could tell that I approached the shell in much the same way as I approached the skin on these two different models, and I try to treat them very differently from each other just to make sure that they were separated enough when they were together in their diorama. I also used the same technique for painting the bandages, however, and I did in the end slightly make them just a little bit brighter on Leo than I did on Raphael. Painting the base coat on the knee pads was much exactly the same as what it was on Raphael, and what I predict is going to be very similar on the other models as well. I'm not sure if I mentioned how to paint the toenails, but basically I thinned down deck tan very thin and painted one layer of that and allowed it to dry, but obviously I got distracted and came back to painting the knee pads and elbow guards once again before coming back with skeleton horde and painting that over the top of the toenails. Once it dries, they look equally as dirty as they should for the nails of Ninja Turtles. I also base coated his mask with a grey and then stuck his thighs into his leg parts. I don't even know, the shorts into the thighs. Once those were stuck, I added a little bit of a darker wash around the edges of the knee pads, again so they weren't exactly the same as Raphael's, before setting to work to dry brushing those lovely bandages all across his feet and arms. As for the colors used, it was a base coat of grey, using deck tan as the main color of the dry brush, and then a white just over the tips and edges where I wanted a little bit more brighter areas. Again, at this time using a blue contrast, I'm going to paint over deck tan to make the colored pieces that are on their arms and also across their foreheads. Now Leo's right arm had a little bit of a situation going on, and I'm not gonna lie, at first I was a bit perturbed, but once broken down into simple elements, it's not that difficult. At first I did a grey over all the bandages. I then dry brushed those bandages and then painted the black of the armor that is on the arm. And once I was done with that black, I then took a little bit of blue in my airbrush and carefully sprayed that just so that it wasn't flat, complete black, and it had a little bit more excitement to it. I then finished off painting the rest of the bandages with the grey and dry brushed those as well. I then added the gold trimming around the edge of the armor and finished the dry brushing with the whitest parts on top of the bandages. After that, I painted the little stitches with a nice bright blue, and that's pretty much an easy way of breaking things down. As for the hands, it was much of the same thing, except there was a little bit less blue and a little bit more darker silver. Speaking of a darker silver, that's where I painted that over the top of the cool little floret thing on the top of his hand, and also on the little rivets that are all over the place. I also used the same gold to paint the edges. Also by gold, what I mean is actually bronze from Pro Acryl. A lot of the time when I'm recording these videos, I do tend to get a little bit sidetracked, and especially painting 2 models in 1 week, it was a lot of work for me, so some things were skipped, and perhaps you don't get to see them in the video. Also, you may notice the video is extremely long, but if you're wanting to see the palette, of course, for the colors, everything will be up on my Patreon. I'll be posting that before the video even goes live, but enough shilling for myself, and let's speak about what I'd done on the model. What you may notice is that I didn't need to paint white before I painted this blue over the handle of this sword handles, and that is because the blue that I had chosen is not a contrast paint. It was actually a very bright one from Vallejo, and Vallejo covers quite well in my opinion. On the rest of the body of this awesome turtle man, he has some straps that are held together by other straps, and in order to change the color slightly, I just painted them red leather without having to search for another color. Red leather seemed to work perfectly fine. Now, I've already explained to you how I painted the armor when I explained it to you on the arm, and so I'm not going to explain it to you again while I paint these other armor things that go around his backside and on his shoulder. And once I was done painting the armor, I strategically glued a couple of parts together. Now, I didn't glue every single part into this model. I did use some strategic magnets just in the arms, and other parts are just pretty much a press fit, or should we say they just hold up by gravity, which, as we know, is not the best way of doing things. But let's not talk about it. If we don't think about it, nothing bad will happen. You can see me sticking on a couple of little things here and there though with some glue, and that is because I just didn't want them to fall off when I was moving the model. Now what you can tell is that I need to brighten up the mask on Leo. That grey was just too dark, and I really want the blues to pop nicely, especially around his eyes. So I used deck tan and grey, and I wet blended across that mask to create a variation of color so that we had a dark to a light when I put the blue on later. Also, he has some weird red makeup markings on in the renders, and so I just decided to paint that anyway. I could have left it out. If you are struggling and don't want to do it, then don't paint that part, but I thought it looked really cool. Much of what's left is pretty much just repeating steps 1 through 3 over and over until you have completed painting all the bits on the model, and that is pretty much what I just did. One thing that you can note here is I take a wash sometimes. The dry brush can get a bit out of hand. You can use that to come back and tidy up some areas if you're careful about your color choices with the wash. now working on these portraits, I'm not gonna lie, I did struggle a little bit. These eyes are quite small and they are sunken into their heads because they're turtles, and apparently that's what turtles look like. And also, the argument was, do I paint the eyes or not? And I decided to paint the eyes because in the references they have got eyes, but also they are referencing from the movie. So in the movie they have eyes, and so I just decided to fight that demon myself. Painting the eyes, I started out with a black, as I normally do with any eye, and then I used pink at the bottom of the eyelid just to create a little bit more life in the eye, and then I used deck tan to paint the general sclera of the eye. I used the fancy word because I've been told about the fancy word and people don't like it when I don't use the fancy word, so I used the fancy word. Once I'm done with the fancy word color of the eye, I then have to come back in and figure out where to place these pupils. I won't lie, it was touch and go with Raph at first. He did look a bit squint, but we pulled it through in the end, so don't worry too much. Speaking of pulling things through, painting teeth is not easy. Genuinely, I've voiced my disdain about painting teeth before, but really, teeth are so difficult to paint, but when you get them right, they do look so good. Leonardo's eyes were pretty simple really. They were just a nice bright blue over the top of a darker blue with a black dot in the middle and a lovely specular highlight before I put those bandages on the back of their heads and stuck their heads onto their torsos and called the models done.
On my feet, turtle shell on my back. I'm the master of the rap game, no one can attack. Painting Leo and rap, bringing the 90s back. Skateboard flow, I'm the best, that's a fact. Cowabunga dudes, kicking it with the crew. Got these 3D printed models looking brand new. From Zed Studios, they know just what to do. Ninja Turtle swag, yeah, we keep it true. I'm fresh like a pizza, straight out of the oven. Rocking shell toe kicks, yeah, I stay buzzing. Flow so smooth, like I'm really out here shredding.
I honestly hope that you enjoyed this video, whether you were painting these models or something similar, and you got some information out of this video that might help you with your next painting endeavor, whatever it is. Even if it was just an enjoyable time while you sat on the toilet, I just hope that you enjoyed the video. I'd like to say a super special thank you to my Patreons, because without them there wouldn't be lights in my eyeballs and the videos might not be able to happen. But more importantly, a thank you to the sponsors of the video, that is Zed Studios as well as Uniformation. Please check them both out in the description. Please also go check out their Instagrams. It's the least you could do is give them a like and a follow. What is it going to hurt anybody? It won't hurt anybody, but what might hurt you is the words I'm about to say. If you didn't like anything in this video, I actually don't care, and now you can f**k off.
It with the crew, got these 3D printed models looking brand new. From Zed Studios, they know just what to do. Ninja Turtle swag, yeah, we keep it true. I'm fresh like a pizza, straight out of the